see pictures of fish in any of my slides. I'm not going to talk about specific impacts on different fish species. I'm going to zoom back out and talk a little bit more generally about how climate change is impacting flows. And we talked a lot about where this information should fit, and we thought maybe it could fit into really any one of the 3 workshops, but we wanted to get the information out kind of early. So a couple of take-home points that I'm going to focus on here is that historical observations are really no longer enough for projecting future conditions. We need to be incorporating more information. We can't rely solely on what we've seen in the past anymore. And our ability to manage interannual variability is actually changing. So, and the underlying system is changing, and that's having very serious impacts on how we can manage and things like carryover storage and from one year to the next. And so when we're thinking about climate change information and doing these analysis, there's kind of 2 things that we need to think about, and one is the value of the historical data, observed data that we have. How can we use that? How do the tools of historical engineering, stationarity still apply to today and our planning processes? And then how do we incorporate future projections of what the climate models and other things are telling us is going to happen in the future? And so with the historical data, that's wonderful stuff. We've seen it. We know that those conditions actually happened in the past. But to the extent that data has already been polluted with changes that are the result of climate change, we need to be aware of that. And then we also need to think about whether those historical observations really represent what we're going to see in the future. So this is a graph of historical precipitation in California. You can see that there's very high variability interannually. We all know that. The blue trace through there is the 11-year rolling average. In addition to the high interannual variability, the one thing that I want to point out in here is that California is also prone to these kind of extended periods where we kind of get stuck in a dry or a wet phase. So you can see in this graph the period between 1908 and 1937 is the driest 30 years in that record, and it's actually about 10% drier than the long-term average. So, and then if you look at the last 30 years, that's actually the wettest period that we've seen in that 116-year period, and it's about 5% wetter than the long-term average. And so you can see that that's a problem when we get stuck in those drier conditions. And so this next graph, why this is really related to climate change is because what this shows is these pink and orange and yellow dots are the number of days that it takes to get half of water supply for a certain area. And you can see California is dominated by pink and orange and yellow dots. We get most of our water supply in less than 15 days a year. So just a few critical storms form the basis of whether we're in that 20% drier than normal conditions or 20% wetter than normal conditions kind of phase. And the climate models are very uncertain about this, but they show that that storm track is likely to change in the future. And the point here is that just a small change in that storm track means 1 or 2 of those storms go north of us or go south of us. That's a huge impact, or that can be a huge impact on our water supply. So we're really concerned about that. And then, of course, average precipitation, there's a lot of uncertainty about in the climate models. Some of them suggest that California might get wetter. Some suggest that we might get drier, that distribution may change. So Northern California may get wetter and Southern California may get drier. But what we are very highly certain about is that it is going to get warmer, okay? And that warmth is going to have impacts on snow water content and our snowpack, which is actually probably a much more important metric to be looking at in terms of water supply and available water for all of our multiple uses. So this is average snow water content on April 1st, so the tail end of the snowfall season each year. And you can see this varies a huge amount as well. And you can really almost start to see in the last 20 years that it might be declining a little bit, and that's what our estimate shows, that we're already losing some of that snowpack, and as we move into the future, we'll lose as much as 25% of the snowpack by 2050. And so, and this is just purely temperature. You could, without the uncertainty over precipitation, just warmer temperatures, that whatever the precipitation we do get, more of it is going to fall as rain. It's never actually going to become snow, and the stuff that does fall as snow is going to come off earlier. And so it won't be around after April or even at April 1st to store. And this is really important because, of course, about a third of California's water supply comes from snowpack. We just don't have the available surface storage to store the water that we need. We depend on that water staying up in the snowpack well into April so that it comes through after the threat of winter storms has passed. Of course, from October to March, we're managing our multi-purpose reservoirs predominantly for flood protection, and so they're maintained with much more storage capacity. We have to let runoff flow through and go past, and we can't store it during that season as much, and so we really depend on this. And so the point here is really that as the underlying system changes, our ability to manage it with the tools that we have really changes, and that has to go into the consideration of flow criteria as well. So this is just another way to look at this. This is a hydrograph of the Sacramento runoff from the Sacramento River Basin, and the blue bars are pre-1955. The purple bars are post-1955, and you can see that in the winter months, October through March, that runoff is actually going up. We're getting more and more of the runoff coming during winter and less coming during spring and summer, when we really would like it to be coming through. And the exact same thing is happening in the San Joaquin River system. So trying to connect this back to setting flow criteria and moving forward with a plan, the update of the Delta Plan. So in 2010, the Delta ecological flow criteria report, or the ecosystem flow criteria report was issued, and this report and others similar to it in the past have used historical unimpaired flows as the basis to set flow criteria. And what I want to point out here, and kind of the point of all of that information that's coming that I gave before, is that these unimpaired flow criteria, or the unimpaired flows, are changing over time. So this is just the same kind of exceedance probability curve that was used, the type of exceedance probability curve that was used in the Delta Ecosystem Flow Criteria Report. And this is for Delta inflow exceedance probability, and this is broken up between October and March again, and April and September. So the top graph, you can see the light blue line in the middle is the entire historical record, 1922 to 2010. The blue line is 22 to 1970, so the far distant past, and then the red line is the near past, the 1971 to 2010, and you can see that this line is shifting through time. And so it matters whether you take the entire record or just the last 30 years or the last 20 years or the last 50 years, you're going to get a different exceedance probability relationship, and it's changing as we go forward. And of course, the red line moving to the right in October to March means that the probability of getting those high flows is higher, and moving to the left in April to September, the probability of high flows is moving lower. And so if you use the entire record, the light blue line, to establish a flow. And what you're actually looking at is something more like the red line. You're likely to be over-regulating flows during part of the year and under-regulating them during the other part of the year. So if historical data isn't enough, actually, before I leave this, I just want to also point out that, so this is just unimpaired flows. So this is the underlying system. And on top of all of that, we have to add the management of the system, which is getting more complicated. Of course, we have these multi-purpose facilities, as I've already talked about. If more of that runoff is coming during the flood season, we have limited ability to store it, and so there's less water available for the actual management. There's actually also the sea level rise issue coming in the delta and having to release more water to repel salinity or to maintain X2 in the same position that it's historically been is going to cost us more water. And so there will be, in addition to these shifts, really less water available for management. The other thing, I just want to read a quote from Fleener et al. 2010 that was actually in the Ecological Flows report in 2010, and it says, ongoing managed and unmanaged changes in the delta will make any static set of flow standards increasingly irrelevant and obsolete for improving conditions for native fishes. Flows should be tied to habitat, fish, hydrologic and other management conditions, as well as our knowledge of the system. And then he concludes with, flows needed for fish native to the delta will change. And I'd like to add to that also what will change is the amount of water available to deliver for those flows is going to be changing in the future. So we need to be cognizant of all of those things. So if historical data isn't enough, what do we need to add? What solutions do I have to offer you to all of this? And unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet to make recommendations. DWR and others have used a number of different techniques and for addressing climate change and analyzing climate change. And as Russ mentioned in my introduction, DWR, myself and my co-author Abdul Khan authored a report in 2010 where we looked at a number of different approaches to both characterizing climate and analyzing climate in California water resource planning studies. And characterizing climate meaning, how do you determine how warm is it going to get? Which projections do you use? How do you characterize what the future climate will be? And then analyzing that. Once you've decided what you're suggesting the climate will look like, how do you take that through your stream flow models, your operational models, fish models, and other things, and how do you treat that data? And what we found in that study was there's a number of different techniques, a lot of strengths and weaknesses in all of them, but there's still some pretty big gaps, too, of things that we're not dealing with that we should be, and we can do better than what we've done in the past. The other thing I will point out in terms of setting flow criteria is most of those studies really relate to planning, project planning and analysis, and planning, long-term planning such as the California Water Plan, and kind of giving an idea of general conditions that will likely exist in the future, which I think is a pretty different type of activity than setting flow criteria. And so I'm not sure that the approaches that BDCP is using and others are using are going to necessarily work that well for what you all are trying to do. So DWR is continuing to develop newer and better techniques, and one of the ways that we're doing this is through engagement with the Technical Advisory Committee. This is a group that DWR has convened, made up of 15 experts in different fields. They're folks from all over California and actually the United States and Canada. There's experts on climatology, hydrology, ecology, local water management, water planning and engineering, water law, and economics. And these folks are charged with helping DWR address all manner of climate change issues that we're dealing with at DWR. Right now, they're helping us develop some scenarios for future projections of climate change to use in our planning studies. But we'd like to extend the offer to the board and board staff to present questions, to participate in this technical advisory group and come to our meetings and listen to what's going on, but also to present questions and if you've got specific issues that you'd like to tackle with this group, we'd be happy to incorporate that into our efforts. So with that, I will turn it over to John.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is John Lehi, Chief of the State Water Project Water Operations Office. And unlike my colleague here, Mr. Schwartz, I am a fish expert. No, actually, I'm a big bad water project operator. So, but I want to thank the board for this opportunity.
Don't you have a green hat and a blue hat?
I was trying to think what color you get with blue and green mixed, but I couldn't come up with it. I want to thank the board for this opportunity to what I feel. I have a unique perspective on this. I don't think any of the presenters thus far fall into the category I do. Our office is responsible for the real-time management of the system. We're basically where the rubber meets the road on water management in the state of California. So I hope that what I feel is my unique perspective here will be of value to this process. So here's an overview of what I plan to cover today. Talking about salinity issues, we want to start with the hydrology, which drives that salinity. And the hydrologic variability that California has. And I want to also, of course, look at how that variability is managed by the water projects and the resulting flows that the Delta actually sees. I think it's important when we look at the managed system that we want to look at the benefits that are received by that managed system, because I think sometimes we forget what the projects are all about in the first place. And especially since the flows that are being considered, where a lot of talk about mimicking the natural hydrograph. So I think it's very important that if we are going to be tinkering with that managed system, to see what some of the trade-offs would be by changing that management capability. The second part of my discussion, I want to go into revisit the ecological uncertainty that's been discussed today and how that has spilled over into the regulatory world as far as uncertainty with operations as well. And then I want to conclude with how we can balance the benefits with that uncertainty. So I'll start with a similar graph that you've seen a couple times today, which is the variability of the Sacramento Valley unimpaired runoff. What I also have depicted here is the various year types that go along with these runoffs. So, yes, indeed, we do know it is quite variable system. How variable is it? How do we quantify that variability? I think this slide here that was also included in the Dettinger 2011 presentation in front of the Delta Stewardship Council does an excellent job of really quantifying the variability of California's hydrology. California is unique in this variability as compared to the rest of the nation. So what you see here, for most of the nation, for the most part, the country's the standard deviation or the variation of precipitation is a small fraction of the average, whereas in California there is a much higher degree of variation from year to year as opposed to that average. And basically that's what we see here. Andrew did a good job of talking about how we're really at the mercy of a handful of storms from year to year. Whether or not they go north or south determines whether we see a good water year or not. So I want to get at what are the benefits to this managed system that we have, and what are the limitations on that ability to manage the hydrology. And so I'm breaking down those benefits into 3 different time frames here. I'll start with the short term. Flood mitigation is the most obvious one there. The interseasonal benefits, which include limiting that salinity intrusion into the delta in the summertime and the fall. We're able to pair up the supply when it's comes in the winter and spring, and provide it for uses, for project uses in the summer when the demand is greatest. And we're also able to collect cold water runoff, to manage cold water pool, to meter that water out during the summer and fall to meet our temperature requirements in the rivers. So those are the interseasonal or midterm benefits to the management of the projects. And then there's the interannual time frame, where some of the supplies from the projects, the stored water will be held over from a year of plentiful water supply to help mitigate against droughts in years where there's shortages. So again, the most obvious, one of the most obvious benefits to the short-term impairments of the natural hydrograph is the storing of water during flood events, knocking those peaks down significantly, and later metering the water out at a flow that the downstream levees are able to handle. The interseasonal management, again, stored water in the winter and the spring is stored and released during the summer and the fall. And so again, that stored water is used to meet the board standards for the in-delta agricultural and M&I uses, as well as provide the supply for the water project south of the delta, and for that temperature management in the rivers. So I'd like to bring this graphic up, which I think is fairly important to kind of describe the what that interseasonal management of the supply, the benefit that creates. This is pre-project, so this is 1921 through 1943, so it's just prior to the construction of Shasta Dam in 1944. And you can see that the isohalines, this is 1,000 milligrams per liter, so that's 4 times the current M&I standard. You can see that those isohalines went deep into the delta during that period prior to the construction of the upstream dams. So since 1944, you see that the limits to the saltwater intrusion is held at bay and that's in compliance with the board standards. This is to meet all those in-delta diverters, agricultural needs, as well as M&I diverters. Also creates the freshwater buffer that makes the project, the big projects, makes their operations possible by providing that freshwater buffer through the delta. Okay, here's a little bit of a busy graph, but this is getting to the point of the InterAnnual Management. So what's depicted here is the last 10 years of state water project allocations. So that would be the gray bars with the percentages. And overlaid on top of that is bar graphs of the, in the colored bar graph is the runoff in year type. And you can see a pretty good correlation between the runoff in a particular year and the allocation capabilities of the project. If you look at the 2007 through 2009 period, that's our last multi-year drought. You can see that at least the first year there, 2007, although the runoff was about as low as it had been the entire 10-year period, the allocations were a moderate range, slightly less than average for that 10-year period at 60%. And so that was due to the ability for the projects to have stored water in the wet 2006 year, and that helped to mitigate at least that first year of shortage of the 3-year drought. Now you can also see that that ability to mitigate the shortages fades away as we continued into the drought because you know, the storage capabilities are limited. And I think this is a pretty important point because this really gets at what are the limitations to the management capabilities of the projects. And so what I'm showing here is that lack of storage. Here's a comparison. This is the storage in comparison to the average unimpaired flow in a couple of basins, the Sacramento Basin versus the Colorado Basin. So you can see that even though the Colorado Basin has slightly less average unimpaired flow as the Sacramento, it has over 5 times the storage capability as the Sacramento system. It's a very storage poor system in relation to the amount of unimpaired flow that we see. And here's the results of that. So this is impaired delta outflow. This is actual outflow from day flow data. So this is showing kind of the average in green. The light blue is a very wet year, one of the wettest years, 1983. And in the blue, dark blue, is 1977, one of the driest years. So you can see that much of the outflow in the system is really unregulated. And I think that's a point that I think a lot of times we don't really get. And so what are the reasons for that? Well, one is what I've just discussed, and that is the storage poor environment of the system. The other is that all of the river basins are not impaired. They're not regulated. Good example would be the middle and south forks of the Yuba River. Also, a good portion of the runoff that we see in the valley is from precip that occurs downstream of the major dams. So we are not able to regulate a good portion of the full natural flow. What this what this graphic also shows that we're unable to regulate, even in the average years, a good portion of the flows that would be used for kind of the interseasonal management. So say taking some of the flows in the January through March period and storing that up and re-releasing it in the summer periods. The green bars in January, February, March, essentially that's equivalent to about, I think it's close to 50,000 CFS, which is, you know, way larger than any of the current standards. And so that water we are not able to regulate. So a lot of this is actually beyond the control of the projects. So for the first part of this presentation, here's a couple of my take-home messages. The first is that really the flood control and water supply benefits are achieved through water management activities that are on the margins of a highly variable hydrologic system. So, I mean, to drive this, you know, another way to say this, there's really a misunderstanding sometimes of how much control the projects really have to manage the system. The second take-home point here is that our expectations would be that a reduction in these impairments or regulating ability will have adverse effects on the benefits that are derived from those impairments. And so that's you know, we need to keep that in mind, that we are storing and impairing, regulating flows for good purposes. Okay, I'll switch gears now and cover the ecological uncertainty that we've heard much about today. The main point that I want to make here is that this ecological uncertainty is strongly influencing the regulatory environment that we operate to as well. So we're seeing a lot of difficulty in trying to operate the system on a year-to-year, month-to-month, day-to-day time frame. And one of the new regulations that came in place recently, of course, is the 2008 and 2009 biological opinions from the fisher agencies. So these increased flow requirements and export restrictions. One of the unique things about these new requirements is that they rely heavily on real-time monitoring. And they use a range of flow objectives rather than just a fixed prescriptive type of requirement. To add to all of this, of course, there's been a lot of litigation. Both of those biological opinions were litigated. They were remanded in 2010, 2011. New process is underway to redo those biological opinions. So we are in a state of flux as far as the regulation is concerned. In the past couple of years, there have been interim operating agreements between the projects, the fishery agencies, and we have implemented actions that have differed from the actions described in the biological opinions. So an example of this would be the Fall X2 action of last year was a preliminary injunction on operating to the criteria as written in the biological opinion. It turns out, as you saw in some of the slides, that the way the hydrology came in last year, actually we came pretty close to meeting the objective, but that was really because of the unique characteristic of the hydrology from last year. We talk about the long-term trends of climate change. Turns out last year, you know, every year is still very different, and last year was not indicative of that change. We saw snowpack extending later into the season than almost any time on record. So we had a large snowpack into July, and that runoff did go towards meeting the fall X2. Another example of these interim operating agreements would be the stipulation this last spring in operating to a substitute for the NIMS San Joaquin River inflow to export ratio. So there was a different set of operating rules, quite different from what's in the biological opinion, and in part these were geared towards testing newly developed scientific hypotheses. So how do we deal with this uncertainty? We've heard a lot about adaptive management approaches today. That seems to be a better fit. What we don't see as a good fit is the prescriptive standards. I think they have a hard time keeping up with the rapidly evolving scientific understanding. So, for instance, a calendar-based or water year type requirement may be too restrictive to present the application to allow for the application of the real-time monitoring type efforts that have been employed as part of the biological opinion actions. And again, the fishery agencies are relying more heavily on these real-time monitoring to set the flow requirements within a range of objectives. And then the adaptive management processes that we've discussed does allow for inclusion of new information that is gathered and lessons learned. The adaptive management process does help balancing as far as tailoring the protective actions to limit the impacts on other beneficial users. So on the point of balancing uncertainty, this actually kind of summarizes a lot of what I had to say here today, and actually what Dr. Summer actually had to say was, the first point here is the relative importance of the enhanced flows is uncertain relative to the other stressors. The second point, which I emphasized in my presentation, is that the trade-offs with other beneficial uses, because we are operating on the margins of the system, that there are likely to be certain and substantial trade-offs with other beneficial users if we enhance the flow from what they are currently. So again, I would just I would also have the adaptive management is recommended as the most effective approach to balancing the uncertainty in this rapidly changing environment of our understanding of the scientific knowledge. This, so this is actually echoed by a number of folks. I'll just conclude with this quote from the National Research Council's 2012 report on the sustainable water and environmental management in the Bay Delta in 2012. And that, the science is necessary to inform us, but it does not provide the entire prioritized, integrated analysis needed. There are other considerations that are also important in determining the best policy. So I'll conclude with that, and I think this panel is ready for your questions.
Great. Questions from the board? Members?
Thanks for the presentations, and I read the materials, Dr. Summer, and thanks for the considerable effort you went to put that together. There, just a couple of things just to stimulate discussion. We hear a lot of a repeated theme today about the importance of adaptive management. And yet, when we start getting, I think where I see a struggle a little bit here is the time scale of modifying the plan, let's say, on the whole circle of things. There's the plan, do, evaluate, respond, and then plan. And I guess the state board, we struggle what was it, the 15-year cycle, of updating the plan. 17, thank you. I'm new at this, so bear with me. So I think maybe I could use a little discussion on sort of what's the useful time scale of adaptive management in your experience, because we talked about the flash study and how, well, let's not react too swiftly in terms of the management changes and the planning changes, because it's one data point. We don't want to overreact. And yet the science is changing and our understanding, and there's concern that if we take some actions, it may be too rigid for our institutional capacity to come back and revisit them within 3 to 5 years. But maybe we need to, collectively commit to something in terms of the plan aspect on a more frequent basis, and thereby adapt better with the climate changes and things like that. So I'm seeing kind of a little bit of a conflict there between the need, to invest in planning, but the need to react quickly for management that is effective on the ecosystem. Do you have any comments to that?
I'm going to echo again Dr. Denise Reed's talk. This is difficult. We don't have any easy answers, but I agree with Dr. Herbold's comment that we learned a remarkable amount of information just from last year. And although there's still a lot that's uncertain, we learned enough to, I think, substantially change the direction of the science that's being done, and I think have some insights into management action. So depending on how things go, if the actions are bold enough, there is a signal that we can see. But we have to also be willing to do some bold actions that may have adverse consequences in order to get the sort of signals that we really like.
Yeah, and I'm sensitive to that, because in hearing the operations presentation, in terms of how sensitive that is, maybe on the operations front, could we comment or respond to some of the discussion about the suggestion that when we mimic hydrology, that lofty goal, what are the management implications of that to the project for that first flush idea, which I guess has been used in other countries based on what we heard earlier today. So, is that a fine-tuning of ops, or is that a game changer, and does it really create a lot of management challenges?
Well, I think kind of the take-home message there is that the projects do only have so much control over that natural hydrograph. I think to a certain extent we get what we get. I think we have to be careful if we are trying to, by the use of the project, to try to meet what is maybe marginally, or to meet what is an arbitrary flow criteria. It maybe look marginal as far as is how much we're pushing the needle, so to speak, but it's a great expense potentially a great expense as far as the supplies that we would be expending towards that particular standard, which, like I said, may be somewhat arbitrary based on a regression, but we just have to be aware of the trade-offs that will occur with a big expense of water. There will be trade-offs, and I think so. It's important to understand that every year is unique as far as the hydrology. Even wet years can look very different from one another. What works very well and is easy to meet in one particular type of wet year could be, if you're trying to meet the same type of standard in a wet year that has a very different fingerprint as far as how the hydrology comes in, could end up being quite costly as far as storage that you expend towards meeting that. So that's, I think, why, I think an adaptive approach, however you want to call it, makes more sense to try to tailor it more towards what's doable and what's not costly to other beneficial uses.
Yeah, I guess that's the challenge. You talk about 15 days a year making the supply. You're early in the season. You don't know how the wet season is going to go. So that first flush, there's a lot of risk from your perspective.
That's right. You don't know if that is the first of many storms you're going to see that winter, or if that's it. For example, getting back to the different types of wet years, 1998 El Nino year, we saw storms all the way from late fall into the late spring, one after another. In 97, we saw just one catastrophic event on New Year's Day, and that was basically it. We had major flooding in both instances, but very different types of year, even though they were both classified as wet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for the invitation to participate in the TAG. I think that's something that we should certainly consider, and for the entire state, it's probably going to be a good venue for anticipating some of the challenges that we're going to have. And the one thing that's come across to me already today is, and it goes to some of the points that John has been bringing up in terms of management, it's not going to be simply the environment that is going to have to be adaptively managed, because there's a lot of uncertainty. It's going to be a lot of the things that we are doing now that, in this case, that are affected by water. So, how people use water, both in agricultural and urban areas. There's going to be a tremendous learning curve for all of us over the next 30, 40 years and longer because of climate change. So I think that's one thing that's come across really clear to me, is that this is not just about fish and streams. It really is about how we operate, and that's what the Delta Stewardship Council was getting at a lot. And on the issue, you raised the issue of uncertainty between flow and other stressors, and I'll just indicate my bias right now. Flow is, and I'll ask Dr. Summer if what he thinks about this. Flow is, we're not talking flow as over here and other stressors over here. There is a relationship between flow and other stressors. Am I not correct?
Yeah, I agree. When we received the board's notice, the way it was worded, there was an implication that the stressors were something else, and I couldn't tease them apart myself, because
Okay.
at some level, everything is affected by flow. We're dealing with an estuary. It's defined by flow.
Okay, good. Well, I like that,
but-
and I think that's true.
At the same time, there are external drivers, though, that feed in, and contaminants is one of those.
So then I guess Matt raised it earlier in the last panel, but what kind of time frame are we dealing with? And I think we're actually dealing with a number of time frames, and this is something that I think for the staff to help us think through. We've got the time frame of now. We've got a time frame associated with ammonia. That was brought up earlier. We have a time frame that's associated with building a tunnel or some change in point of diversion and a new system. We've got a time frame of sea level rise. We've got a time frame of major snowpack change, so that we can actually say it has changed. And so I think we're going to probably have to come up with a nested set of ideas or approaches or regulatory regulatory elements that recognize these different time frames and have a way of being triggered to move into whatever the next time frame is, whether it be a structural trigger or whether it be a climate related trigger. And so that's another thing that's come through to me, that we're dealing with a lot of different time frames. And that, I guess finally, right now we are dealing with a very a species situation where the species are not very resilient, that we are trying to deal with. And so building up that resiliency, because it's only going to get more strange and more uncertain, and it's only going to get more difficult. So there is a real need to have more resiliency for the critters that are out there trying to adapt to these situations as well. So we're going to need some help in figuring out how to make those kinds of trade-offs, if you will, or others there's going to have to be a lot of trading going on among all of us who are using this water. Thank you.
That was great. And I do think the challenge of the balancing the co-equal goals, which is now state policy, is something that has to be taken into consideration as we do it. But it's not going to be one or the other. It's how do we hit the sweet spot in a highly variable system with uncertainty, and how do we find ways together to make the best guess. I just had two quick questions. I'll have perhaps thousands more in the course of this process. But first one, Dr. Summer, just to help me, I was surmising that a bit of the difference between your presentation and the preceding presentations was that you included other stressors, while some other folks were focusing narrowly on the question asked about salinity. And I was trying to determine whether there was disagreement, as substantial a disagreement perhaps between you and the previous speakers as one might superficially have surmised from the difference in presentation and some of the things you said. But I also, as I was thinking, I thought, people were caveating there too, that there's not as big of a disagreement as some of the people listening may have thought. So I thought I'd ask you just to define the difference, which you did a little bit just now, but just help me understand any perceived differences in how you would perceive things as opposed to the earlier speakers, and so I can figure out how to take that into account.
Well, part of the reason you didn't hear more about the flow part in our presentation was twofold. First, you asked for new information since 2010. We said a lot in our previous submissions about flow, and didn't want to repeat a lot of that information here. Secondly, a lot of the new information related to the fall habitat studies, the report hasn't been released, and so we were hesitant to go too far in describing what the importance was. But I think our previous submissions were fairly clear that we agree that flow is a major determinant of distribution of fishes of the estuary. There's quite strong evidence for the effects of flow on in the wintertime and spring on the abundance of several species. Fair bit of uncertainty, though, about fall in particular. And I think we were fairly clear that we still believe that that's an area where the jury is still very much out. And that's, again, based on a group effort with the flash report. So, to be honest, I think some of the other presenters had thought that the 2011 results were maybe more convincing.
And then help me understand a little bit about the, you were talking about how smelt had been found in other places, and as opposed to the low salinity zones that were shown in some of the other slides. Is that something where you feel that the fish agencies aren't counting ones they should be counting? I mean, that's, again, what someone listening for the first time would think.
It's not due to any fault of the fish agencies. We're incredibly valuable. It's incredibly valuable to have these long-term surveys. They were developed, decades ago for sort of a different suite of species than we commonly focus in on now. So we have to rely on those long-term data. But what we've started to do now is do more and more sampling on the margins. And to the extent possible, we're trying to expand that sampling to provide some comparability. So that was one of the examples I gave for the Liberty Island sampling, where there is a fairly long-term database for delta smelt using beach seine methods in the delta, and the same agency has used the same methods now in a new habitat so that we can stitch the two together and learn something about the areas that we hadn't really investigated before.
Interesting. And then I want to switch to adaptive management for a second. I thought Fran's timeframes, the timeframes come in sort of myriad ways. And one of the other things that I think could come out of someone listening to this discussion, this for all of you, I actually really thought the variation in your presentations was incredibly interesting. Having sat in a number of your chairs, they're not the scientific one, in different, worn different hats, I found it really interesting. Presentation, because I do know that when you're in operations, you do see things very differently. Having been in operations, it was sort of an epiphany, life changer for me, just in terms of having to deal every day with myriad things. So I have a lot of sensitivity to the challenge of your team's job. But on adaptive management, I'm getting a sense, I'm a big lover of adaptive management because it makes sense. I do like the chart a lot. I even color-coded it, so you can either count all the bubbles or you can just have several, depending on what you're comfortable with in terms of complexity. But I do think that's another arena where we might have some different perceptions about time frames. And I think for us, it's going to be hard to figure out how to apply it. I think it's pretty clear that if you kind of aim high in steering and look in the long run, and particularly from a scientific standpoint, adaptive management is absolutely the way to go. Figuring out how to adaptively manage in the short run in terms of operations is also something we have to figure out how to do, and we need to figure out in some ways the extent to which we can structure it into a regulatory format, because you can't regulate cooperation. I have tried in a variety, in settlements of lawsuits and in a regulatory context. And so what the doability of how to maximize both of the co-equal goals and dealing with information with humans involved, even wonderful, assuming all good will, is challenging as people speak different languages, even within, let's just pick English, let alone the other languages we need to speak. But even within English, there's like just different worlds. And so I'm not necessarily asking for a comment, but asking for your thinking caps and help in all of you, really, in helping us think about the how to do it question in terms of the extent to which we can integrate adaptive management and this practical sensibility into all the work that we do, because in theory it's all terrific. Figuring out how to put it into a workable framework, I think, is the challenge for all of us in the short run, let alone the long run. And I like Fran's notion of really setting out some of the clear time frames in which we're working, which I think even as the Delta Council struggled with, we didn't get quite right. It's not as clear at all as it ought to be, or as I think as the statute intended it to be. But that's an iterative process as well. So,
Staff, do you have questions?
No, we can go ahead and move on.
Okay.
Great. So I know that you guys need to break at 3:25. So I'd like to at least get the other panel up here and get them started with the first presentation. So if we could have the environmental and NGO folks come up and get started, and then we'll break at 3:25, and when then we come back. Is anybody shorter? Does anybody have a shorter one?
John's, because he's not going to say anything.
Can we do him, or is it out of order?
Brock?
He's going to say, I agree with what John said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yes.
So we can get one.
Actually, I'll read to you. That's only on our website too. Read the draft. Oh, yeah, okay. Read that one. It actually outlines a whole bunch of other triggers, a whole bunch of other things besides just the.
Yeah, because I mean that's what we're getting. And there's more than the flow, but also even in the flow thing, I emphasize with the calendar requirement. You know, it's like, look, this isn't winter. Look at outside. So we can drill down. It gets a little complicated.
Okay, we're going to go a little bit out of order from what you see in the agenda. And we're going to squeeze in Fred Lee first and then take our break.
It's okay. Thank you. No.
Okay, so are you ready, Fred? You can hit your little button there.
We need to change. Go to the Lee slides. They've changed the order. We ready? All right. I want to take a different approach to discussing this whole issue of flows and incorporate the issue of the need for flows to help control pollution in the Delta. It's a different approach. It's something that needs to be considered as part of any deliberations on what should be the State Water Resources Control Board's approach toward incorporating flows for protection of Delta Trust resources in the Delta. This is based on my wife and my presentation. We have a major report with references submitted to the State Board for backup information. I'm going to present just a very short summary of that information. How do you change this? Part- There. My overall finding is that in establishing public trust flows through and into the Delta and through the Delta channels, the State Water Resources Control Board should incorporate flow levels necessary for mitigating the water quality impacts of Delta pollutants. All right? Basically, I'm saying, and I'll justify this in a minute, that we need dilution flows because we're not going to control the impacts of all of the various kinds of pollutants that exist in the Delta, now or in the future. And so I want to discuss this issue of dilution flows to help protect the public trust resources of the Delta. The first issue I want to address is that it is important to establish tributary flows into the Delta and through the Delta channels that are sufficient to minimize, you don't control, but you minimize the water quality impacts of pollutants discharged to the Delta tributaries and within the Delta. We have what I call 3 different kinds of pollutants that need to be considered. There are the classic pollutants of 100 or so, of regulated pollutants in which there are water quality objectives set up by the Clean Water Act. We have unregulated known pollutants where we know they are present in the delta, but we're not establishing or implementing water quality objectives to control them. And the third group is the unrecognized pollutants, of which there is a vast arena for which we're not addressing at all, either through water quality objectives or other so forth. These pollutants are derived from agricultural tailwater and stormwater discharges, municipal wastewater discharges, and stormwater runoff from urban areas such as Sacramento and Stockton. These pollutants threaten delta water quality, and by water quality I mean aquatic life and other beneficial uses, and are a definite threat to the public trust resources of the delta. Now, if we look at this whole issue of the Clean Water Act, and I've been involved with this since it first was passed back in the 70s, the Clean Water Act approach is based on exceedance of water quality criteria, standards, or in California we call them water quality objectives. And once there's an exceedance of a water quality objective, we establish a total maximum daily load to control these exceedances. This is the Clean Water Act approach. This approach has worked well for certain discrete, readily controllable sources such as municipal and industrial wastewater discharges. It is not working well and will not work well for a variety of other pollutants that are coming from non-point sources. We know, for example, that major sources of pollutants in the delta are not controlled by water quality objectives. There are presently many unrecognized pollutants and new and expanded use chemicals that are coming into the delta daily that we're not addressing at all. And we also have this whole issue of implications of the cost of meeting water quality objectives for such things as dairies or for stormwater runoff from urban areas, et cetera. The Clean Water Act is inadequate for screening materials that can be added to delta waters through urban and agricultural sources. We know that flow impacts how pollutants impact water quality through the intensity of the impact, the aerial extent of the impact, and the location. And we really need very detailed monitoring and funding for Clean Water Act-based regulations to make this system work. There are no water quality criteria, standards, or objectives for all known potential pollutants that are in the delta and that will occur in the future. We also have an issue here with respect to the balancing approach. The Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board admits that it has adopted a balanced approach for regulating certain kinds of pollutants, such as from dairies. They say we're going to allow some pollution to occur in the name of keeping dairies in business. The same kind of thing is occurring with respect to ag drainage. The ag drainage in the Central Valley is not being regulated as it could be if the Clean Water Act were fully enforced to control all discharges from agricultural sources to meet water quality objectives so there's no more than one exceedance every 3 years. A major example of how flow impacts water quality is the low DO problem in the San Joaquin River Deepwater Ship Channel just below the Port of Stockton. Each year, including now, we have low DO problems in the Deepwater Ship Channel associated now primarily with the growth of algae and upstream sources which decompose in the Delta Deepwater Ship Channel. This low DO blocks the fall run of shrimp salmon to their home stream waters. It is associated primarily with a diversion of delta flows by the state and federal export projects in the South Delta. This is well documented now through the studies that were conducted several years ago. We now know, because of the extensive studies that were done on the Deepwater Channel flow issues, that if we had now about 1,000 CFS going through the deepwater ship channel, that we would eliminate the water quality objective violations. This is a case where, through detailed studies, we've been able to establish the clear relationship between flow in the channel and water quality objective violations. Now, we have a similar problem in the South Delta, where we have stagnant zones in certain of the channels, results in violations of the water quality objectives, and we have had documented fish kills there, all related to DWR's attempts to control flow in the South Delta channels. This is not under control at this point, and it's not even being controlled at all. There's also a major problem with flows in the Delta because of the export projects sucking the home stream water signal from the San Joaquin River watershed to the pumps, and thereby depriving the fall run Chinook salmon the opportunity to find their home stream water in the San Joaquin River watershed. This is clearly related to flow issues, and if you had sufficient flow down the San Joaquin River all the way to the bay, then they would have the home stream there signal to get there. Another issue we find with respect to the whole issue of the State Water Resources Control Board and IEP Delta monitoring under D1641, the water rights decision, is that the monitoring that's been done, and is being done now, is grossly inadequate to evaluate the impact of Delta water exports on Delta water quality. D1641 makes it clear that you should understand these issues. If you issue a water rights decision, that this decision then has to include understanding what that water right means to impairing water quality within the Delta. That's not being done. So, issue one, conclusion. Dilution flows into and through Delta channels needed to reduce the impacts of regulated pollutants, known unregulated pollutants, and unrecognized pollutants. And our recommended approach is to implement the Clean Water Act through the maximum extent possible based on reliable technical information, assessments, and adequate funding. And we need to establish sufficient public trust flows in the Delta to help reduce the impacts of inadequately controlled pollutants. This is basically dilution to solve the pollution problem, but it is real. You're not going to solve it through Clean Water Act, for sure. Now, the second issue I want to touch on is this whole business of the BDCP tunnel diversion, where we're going to take 9,000 CFS of Sacramento River water around the Delta for export.
Excuse me, Fred. I'm just doing a time check for you guys. I know you have a schedule you need to keep. Should we stop now or should we keep going?
I've got about 2 sentences and I'm
Go.
finished. All right? The overall conclusion from this is that, first of all, that the tunnel diversion project has a significant potential to cause serious water quality problems in the Delta, and that the State Water Resources Control Board should, as part of establishing public trust flows into and through the Delta, include flow levels necessary to mitigate water quality impacts of Delta pollutants. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Do you guys, will you be back around 3:45? Is that? Okay, so we'll reconvene at 3:45 here in this room. Thank you.